What if I told you that the very first houses in the Wild West were literally invisible? Pioneers arriving on the Great Plains expected to see forests straight out of paintings and movies, perfect for building log cabins. But all they saw was a vast ocean of tough grass stretching to the horizon. There was nowhere to take shelter, nowhere to hide, and the icy wind blew as if the landscape itself was trying to push people back to where they came from. In these conditions, they had to make a decision that seemed to defy common sense: to build their homes not upwards, but downwards. Their dwellings resembled burrows more than houses, dug directly into the ground, damp and heavy, but the only thing that could protect them from the prairie cold. These underground shelters saved the pioneers, although every night in them was a test. The ground collapsed, the roofs leaked, and the walls had a life of their own. And yet it was these burrows that became the first real homes on the frontier. It was the architecture of desperation: minimal materials, maximum endurance. All they had was the earth. It served as their walls, roof, and even part of their heating. Any modern person finding themselves in such a shelter would consider it unfit for living. But for the first settlers, it was their only line of defense against the endless winter. Watch this video to the end to find out how the pioneers turned raw earth into living space, why these dugouts were better than any log cabin, and what single materials served as their building resource, insulation, and fuel. What if I told you that everything you believed about the Wild West was a lie? The image of a cowboy building a log cabin was only a reality in the mountainous, wooded areas. For the hundreds of thousands of settlers who flocked to the Great Plains of Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakota, the reality was shocking. They arrived in the Great American Desert, a vast, flat space where there was not a single tree suitable for construction for hundreds of kilometers around. This was the first and most significant psychological blow. People who had come from the forested states of the East or from Europe found themselves in a world consisting only of sky and grass. They had plows to plow, but no axes to chop. And the first winter in the prairies was approaching with relentless speed, promising blizzards and frosts capable of freezing a person in a matter of minutes. In this situation, they had only two options: turn back or improvise. Those who stayed made a radical decision. If there were no materials for construction on the ground, and it was relatively warm underground, then they would have to go underground. Thus was born one of the most amazing and little-known pages in the history of frontier development: the era of dugouts. The decision to settle in a burrow was not an easy one. It meant giving up all notions of a civilized home, of light, cleanliness, and space. It was an acknowledgement that nature was stronger here, and the only way to survive was to literally hide from it in its own depths. For many settlers, especially women, moving from a relatively comfortable wagon to a damp, dark hole in the ground was a severe moral test. They had to not only build a house, but also maintain some semblance of human life, order, and hygiene in it. It was not just construction, it was a battle to preserve sanity. This first underground phase of prairie settlement is often omitted from heroic stories about the conquest of the West. It was too dirty, too desperate, and too far removed from the image of the victorious pioneer. But it was these people, willing to live like moles, who paved the way for future generations. We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think was the most difficult part of this decision? The physical labor or the psychological pressure of living underground? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how one mistake in choosing a location for a home could cost a family their lives? The first step in building a dugout was not digging, but thorough reconnaissance. The pioneers spent hours, even days, wandering around their plot, studying the terrain. Everything depended on the right choice, whether the house would be dry, warm, and safe. The most desirable location was the southern or eastern slope of a small hill or ravine. This location offered several strategic advantages. First, the slope already served as one or even two walls, which halved the amount of exhausting earthwork. Second, the south-facing entrance caught the precious winter sun and was protected from the prevailing north winds. It was critically important to find a balance between proximity to water and safety. The house had to be located near a stream or river so that water did not have to be carried for miles. but at the same time, it had to be significantly above the level of spring flooding. One mistake, and meltwater could flood the shelter in a matter of hours, destroying all supplies. Experienced settlers carefully studied the soil. They needed dense, clayey soil that would hold its shape well and not crumble. Sandy or rocky soil was a nightmare, as it required additional reinforcement of the walls with boards. And, as we remember, there were no boards. Drainage was the #1 word in the vocabulary of a dugout builder. A pioneer had to think like a hydraulic engineer. A shallow drainage ditch was always dug around the future house to divert rainwater and meltwater from the walls and roof. Without this, the shelter would quickly turn into a dirty, damp cellar. Once the location was chosen, it was marked out on the ground. A standard dugout rarely exceeded 3 by 4 meters in size. It was a tiny space, but the pioneers understood that the smaller the volume, the easier it was to dig and, more importantly, to heat. The tools were very primitive: a pickaxe to break up the dense prairie soil and a shovel to remove it. It was hard, monotonous work that took from several days to several weeks. All the excavated soil was neatly piled up nearby. It would come in handy later. Often dugouts were dug on flat ground, without any slope. In this case, a rectangular pit 1.5 to 2 meters deep was dug. The walls of such a pit were then built up using the only material available: turf. It was a hybrid of a dugout and a house, but it required more effort. Thus, choosing a location was a difficult task with many variables. The pioneer had to consider the wind, sun, water, soil type, and drainage all at once. Any of these variables could make his life either bearable or unbearable. But digging a hole was only half the battle. The bare earth walls were cold and damp. Ready to find out what single material, considered trash by Europeans, became the marble of the prairies and the key to survival? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the pioneers: how they built walls as strong as brick from ordinary grass. This secret was called sod, but it wasn't the loose sod we see on lawns. It was a unique material created over thousands of years. The roots of tall prairie grasses, such as bison grass, intertwined to form a carpet so dense and strong that it was almost impossible to tear apart. When the pioneers realized this, a revolution took place. They understood that they were not living in a desert, but on a giant warehouse of free, self-renewing building material. All they needed was a tool capable of extracting it. And such a tool was created: a special sod plow. This plow did not turn the soil like a conventional one. It was designed to cut a perfectly flat strip of turf like a knife cutting butter. The plow cut long strips about 30-40 centimeters wide and 10-15 centimeters thick. This was the standard building block of the prairies. These long strips were then cut with a shovel into bricks about 60-90 centimeters long. Each brick was incredibly heavy, weighing 20 or even 30 kilograms. Sod harvesting was one of the most exhausting jobs on the farm. The secret to its strength lay in the laying technique. The pioneers built with sod as if it were brick, using classic jointing. Each subsequent row was laid with an offset so that the joints did not coincide. This gave the wall incredible strength. The sod bricks were laid with the grass facing down. This was done so that the roots would continue to grow, intertwining with each other and making the wall even more monolithic. In fact, the pioneer's house was alive. Over time, the wall became so strong that it was difficult to break through even with a pickaxe. Such walls had phenomenal properties. First, they were incredibly thick, from 60 centimeters to a meter. This provided excellent thermal insulation. Inside such a house, it was warm in winter and cool in summer. Second, turf walls were practically fireproof. In a world where grass fires were common and could destroy everything in their path, this was an invaluable quality. Fires simply could not ignite these dense, moist earthen blocks. Building a small house required cutting sod from an area of several acres. It was a huge job, but the result was worth it. A house built from Nebraska marble, as the settlers proudly called it, could last for decades. These walls were not just a shelter, they were a symbol of ingenuity and adaptation. The pioneers did not conquer nature. They learned from it and used its own tools to survive. If you think such remarkable ingenuity deserves respect, please support our channel with a like. Guess how long it took a family to find a single log for their roof? In the treeless prairie, wood was the most valuable and scarce resource. You could dig a hole, you could cut sod, but to cover the ceiling, you needed at least one long, sturdy beam, a ridgepole. The search for this beam turned into a real quest. Families could travel dozens of kilometers to the nearest river to find driftwood washed up on the shore. Sometimes several families would join forces and organize an expedition to distant wooded hills to bring back a few logs. If they couldn't find wood, they had to buy it. At the few sawmills that appeared with the arrival of the railroad, the prices for lumber were astronomical. One beam for the roof could cost more than the entire plot of land. When the ridge beam was finally found and installed, it became the foundation for the entire roof. Thinner rafters were laid across it. Everything was used: branches of willow trees growing by the stream, thick sunflower stalks, or even old tool handles. A layer of brushwood or tall grass was laid on this sparse framework. This layer had to hold the next heaviest component. The roof, like the walls, was covered with a layer of turf bricks. The turf roof was heavy, but it retained heat well and protected from the wind. However, it had one catastrophic flaw: it leaked. In the spring, during the snowmelt, or during heavy summer rains, the roof began to cry. Water slowly seeped through the thickness of the earth, and dirty, murky slush began to drip from the ceiling. Women had to place buckets, basins, and pots throughout the house to collect this water. Sometimes the rain continued inside the house for several days after it had stopped outside. Over time, the settlers learned to make roofs more waterproof by laying turf in several layers, like tiles, and carefully tamping the joints with clay. But it was almost impossible to completely eliminate leaks. Life in a dugout was a constant battle with water. What other difficulties awaited the pioneers inside their dugouts? In the next chapter, you will learn how they made these dark shelters livable. Upon entering a pioneer's dugout, you would first notice three things: darkness, cramped quarters, and the smell of damp earth. Even if it was a bright sunny day outside, inside it felt like early evening. Light barely penetrated deep inside, and the air was cool and slightly heavy. The earthen walls absorbed sound, so the silence inside was almost oppressive. The dampness was immediately noticeable. It emanated from the walls, the floor, and even the objects. The interior design was dictated not by aesthetics, but by harsh necessity. Every inch of space was used to maximum efficiency. There could be no empty corners in the dugout. Everything was subordinated to survival. Families carefully thought out the location of each item so that the cramped space would not turn into chaos. In such conditions, disorder could become a real problem. Even small changes in the layout could make life easier or more difficult for the whole family. Therefore, the furnishings were simple but well thought out. The floor was the earth itself. After the excavation was completed, it was carefully leveled and compacted. This process took a long time. Sometimes it took several days to achieve a flat surface. Furniture stayed in place better on compacted earth, and less dirt accumulated. But even such a floor remained cold and dusty. It was not ideal, but it was the only possible solution in the early years. Sometimes women mixed clay with water and ash and washed the floor with this mixture. This method required skill. The mixture had to be thick but easy to apply. After drying, the surface became much harder, almost like cement. Such a floor was easier to sweep and crumbled less. It created a sense of order and cleanliness that was so lacking in an earthen dwelling. In the early years, plank flooring was something one could only dream of. The bare earth walls were a constant source of dust and dirt. In dry weather, they crumbled, and in wet weather, they slowly began to spread. Any touch left a mark on clothing. To solve this problem, the walls were first leveled with a layer of clay. This reduced crumbling and made the surface smoother. Such a layer held the shape of the walls and protected the interior from particles of earth. Then, if possible, the walls were whitewashed with lime or simply coated with light-colored clay. Lime was an expensive commodity, so few could afford it. But where it was used, the room became noticeably lighter. The light-colored coating reflected the rare sunlight that entered the room. The interior no longer seemed gloomy and oppressive. This not only made the room cleaner, but also visually brighter. The wealthiest or most inventive pioneers went further. They covered the walls with burlap, old newspapers, or cheap fabric. These materials not only improved the appearance, but also created a thin barrier between the residents and the cold ground. Paper and fabric trapped dust and protected against crumbling soil particles. Sometimes newspapers were glued overlapping, creating something like homemade wallpaper. This made the dwelling more humane and homely. This created a barrier between the inhabitants and the cold, damp earth. Even a thin layer of fabric could reduce the feeling of dampness. In a dugout, anything that added comfort was important, even if it did little to change the temperature. Such improvised decor also protected the walls from accidental damage, which could easily occur from furniture or tools. For families tired of constant dirt, this seemed like a real blessing. It also provided some relief from crumbling dirt. Furniture was almost always homemade and built in. Boards were obtained with great difficulty, so every wooden item was valuable. Often, furniture was made from the remains of wagons, boxes, or old carts. Beds were often carved directly into the earthen walls, creating niches for sleeping. This saved space and provided a stable structure. The simplicity of the forms was compensated for by their practicality. Tables and benches were knocked together from boards from dismantled wagons. Sometimes a family had only one table, around which all life took place. During the day, food was prepared on it. In the evening, clothes were mended. And at night, children could use it as an extra sleeping place. Benches were made long so that several people could sit on them at once. All this was created with maximum functionality in mind. There was no room for anything superfluous in a dugout. The whole family's life took place in a single room. Here they cooked, ate, worked, treated illnesses, and slept. Sometimes people and pets lived in the same room, especially in winter. This made the space even more cramped, but it provided additional warmth. In such conditions, conversations were whispered so as not to wake the others. Privacy was a luxury that no one could afford. Lighting was a big problem. Even on a clear day, the dugout was dimly lit. In the evening, the only source of light was a kerosene lamp or a candle if there was no kerosene. These lamps smoked and filled the room with the smell of burning. In winter, the soot mixed with moisture, forming dark spots on the ceiling. There was not enough light even for simple tasks. The only source of daylight was a tiny window. Its size was dictated by several factors: the difficulty of cutting out the opening and the risk of weakening the structure. A large window could cause a collapse, so the opening was kept to a minimum. In the best case, it was a real sheet of glass, bought for a lot of money. For many families, buying glass was almost a luxury, but even a small window meant a lot. But more often than not, the opening was covered with oiled paper or cloth. This substitute only let in scattered dim light. However, it protected the room from wind, insects, and precipitation. The paper had to be changed regularly as it tore quickly and became saturated with moisture. Some families used several layers at once. This improved the lighting and insulation a little. It let in dim, scattered light, but protected against the wind. And in winter, this was most important because the slightest crack could lead to the room freezing. The fabric windows saved people from drafts and made the house more resistant to blizzards. Although there was little light, people learned to work in such conditions. Their eyes got used to the dim light and life went on. In a dugout, every ray of light was important. The door was another weak spot. It was incredibly difficult to keep the cold out in the prairies. The wind found every crack. Therefore, they tried to place the entrance on the leeward side. But even then, the cold penetrated inside. Doors were made from any available boards, sometimes from several pieces. The quality of the wood was of little interest to anyone. It was more important to simply have a door. It was nailed together from any available boards. Sometimes the door was heavy and did not fit the opening well. In such cases, it was insulated with rags, felt, or old blankets. If there were no boards, the entrance was simply covered with a blanket, skin, or piece of tarpaulin. Such a curtain swayed with every gust of wind. It hardly retained any heat, but still provided minimal protection. What if I showed you how fire was both a savior and the deadliest enemy in an underground house? The hearth was the heart of the dugout. It provided warmth for survival in winter, was used to cook food, and dried wet clothes. But placing an open fire in a cramped earthen burrow was an extremely difficult and dangerous task. In the early stages, settlers built primitive fireplaces directly into the wall. They were carved into the earth and lined with flat stones, if they could be found. This was very inefficient. Most of the heat escaped up the chimney, and the fireplace itself smoked heavily. The chimney was a separate engineering challenge. It was laid out with sod bricks, like the rest of the house. It was thickly coated with clay on the inside to protect it from fire. But over time, the clay cracked, and the risk of fire became very high. A safer, though no less complicated option was to run the chimney through the roof. Sometimes an old bottomless barrel was used for this purpose, which was placed on the roof and covered with turf and clay. It was ugly but functional. The appearance of the cast iron stove, known as a bourgeois stove, was a real revolution. It was expensive, but those who could afford it enjoyed enormous advantages. The stove was much more efficient than a fireplace, providing more heat with less fuel consumption and being safer. It was also easier to vent the chimney outside, but the main problem was not the stove itself, but the fuel. There was no firewood around, and the pioneers again turned to the only available resource, what the prairie had to offer. In the summer and fall, families spent weeks gathering fuel for the winter. The first option was twisted grass. Tall, dry grass was gathered, twisted into very tight bundles, and left to dry. These grass logs burned quickly and hot, but required constant attention. The second and more common fuel was kia, or dried manure. Families collected it throughout the prairie, brought it home, and stacked it in neat piles next to their homes. This material provided even long-lasting heat and was almost odorless when burned in a hot stove. Thus, fire, tamed in a safe stove and fueled by grass and manure, allowed people to survive the harsh winters. But it also required constant vigilance. What other dangers awaited the inhabitants of dugouts besides fire? In the next chapter, we will talk about the invisible enemies that turn life underground into a daily struggle. Life in a dugout was not only a struggle against cold and hunger, but also against more insidious, invisible enemies. The main one was dampness. The earthen walls and floor constantly breathed moisture. Even in dry weather, the dugout smelled like a cellar. During rains, this problem became catastrophic. As we have already mentioned, the turf roof inevitably leaked. Water seeped through the ground and dripped from the ceiling in murky, dirty drops. Clothes, bedding, sacks of flour, everything got wet. The dampness led to mold growth. Green and black spots spread across the walls, spoiling supplies and making the air heavy and unhealthy. For the women responsible for household chores, it was a never-ending, exhausting, and losing battle. The second enemy was dirt. No matter how carefully the floor was tamped down, it remained earthen. Any drop of water spilled on it turned it into a sticky mess. The walls constantly crumbled, covering everything with a thin layer of dust and sand. The settlers said that dirt got into their food while cooking, crunched between their teeth, and rustled in their beds. Keeping things clean in such conditions was practically impossible. It required constant effort and incredible strength of spirit. The third enemy was darkness. The only tiny window, often covered with oiled paper, provided very little light. Even at noon, the dugout was in semi-darkness. It was always dark in the back of the room. Women had to cook, sew, and clean almost by touch. This constant lack of light had a depressing effect on the psyche, causing melancholy and apathy. Long winter evenings, when the only source of light was a smoky lamp or a single expensive candle, seemed to drag on endlessly. Poor ventilation was another serious problem. In a cramped room where food was cooked, laundry was dried, and several people slept, the air quickly became stale. It was very difficult to ventilate the dugout without cooling it down. All these factors, constant dampness, dirt, darkness, and stale air, created extremely difficult living conditions. They undermined health and morale. Surviving in a dugout meant not only building it, but also learning to withstand these daily exhausting trials. The dugout, or dugout, was almost always considered temporary housing. It was an emergency measure, a first step that allowed people to survive 1 or 2 winters until they could build something more permanent. The next step in this evolution was the soddy, a house built of sod. Unlike the dugout, which was underground, the soddy was built on the ground. It was not underground, but was a full-fledged above-ground structure. The walls of this house were completely laid out with the same sod bricks as before. The construction technology was similar to bricklaying. Turf blocks were laid in 2 rows with an offset, which gave the wall an incredible thickness, up to 1 meter. The space between the rows was sometimes filled with loose soil for better insulation. Such a house was much drier and lighter than a dugout. It was possible to cut more windows in it, as the walls were strong and stood on their own. Settlers who had saved up a little money could afford not 1, but 2 or 3 real glass windows. The floors in the sod house were also a step forward. If a family could afford it, they would lay a wooden floor. This was a real luxury that permanently solved the problem of dirt and dampness coming from the ground. The roof remained a problem. It was made in the same way as in dugouts, from turf laid on sparse rafters. But sometimes, if they managed to buy boards, the roof was made of wood and covered with tarred paper or even tiles if funds allowed. The sod house could be larger in size. Often it consisted of 2 rooms, a common kitchen living room and a separate bedroom. This was an incredible step forward compared to a 1-room dugout. Families now had something resembling personal space. These sod houses became a true symbol of the Great Plains. They were ugly, squat, with grass often growing through their walls and leaky roofs, but they were sturdy, warm, and built from what was at hand. Thousands of families lived in these houses. They were born, grew up, and started their own families in them. The sod house was no longer just a shelter from the weather, but a real home, a hearth that the family had created with their own hands in the middle of what seemed to be an uninhabitable desert. Living conditions on the frontier had a powerful social effect. Where civilization was just beginning to make its way, wealth and status meant almost nothing. When everyone around you lives in equally primitive shelters, whether dugouts or turf houses, the social differences brought from the East are erased. Expensive suits, big city habits, and family traditions disappeared under a thick layer of dirt and wind. In the face of the elements, everyone became equal. Bankers and farmers, recent immigrants and war veterans, everyone started from the same place, a hole in the ground. This equality was not an ideology. It was a direct consequence of the conditions of survival. No one could rely on their usual privileges. Nature made no exceptions. Those who arrived from the East with high ambitions quickly realized that the only things that mattered here were the ability to work and endure. People learned from each other, regardless of their origins. This mutual exchange of experience made communities stronger. It gradually created a new frontier culture. This created a unique sense of community and mutual assistance. In the vast expanses of the Great Plains, the human voice had little power, and only a neighbor could come to the rescue in time. Neighbors living a few kilometers apart were vital. No family could expect to survive a drought, a storm, or a harsh winter alone. The need for support became the basis of social ties. No one could build a house or survive the winter alone. Building a house was a community affair. When a new family arrived on their plot, their arrival was an event for the whole neighborhood. Neighbors came from all over the area to help. The men brought their oxen and plows to cut the sod and lay the foundation for the future house. Together, they raised the walls, cut the blocks, and put up the heavy roof beams. On days like these, the work went quickly because it was done by everyone together. Meanwhile, the women prepared food for everyone and helped to furnish the interior. They brought old blankets, fabric, dishes, or kerosene, anything that could make the first weeks easier for the new family. Women were often the first to help tidy up the inside of the house, hanging up fabrics and arranging dishes. They cooked large pots of hearty food so that the workers could labor all day. This care was just as important as the men's physical help. Mutual support began from the very first hours. These first primitive dwellings became centers of social life. Not only families gathered there, but entire settlements when there was a reason to do so. The first school in the area was often located in someone's dugout. The teacher lived with the same family, sharing their cramped space day and night. Classes were held on damp ground and in dim light. But knowledge was more important than everyday inconveniences. The teacher lived in a dugout with the owners. This was common practice because there was simply no separate housing for teachers. Children from nearby farms came to class, sitting on the floor and benches. Sometimes they had to sit directly on the ground if there was not enough furniture. Lessons were held whenever fieldwork permitted. Everyday life and education existed side by side. Similarly, the first church or place for Sunday gatherings was often located in the largest sod house in the area. People gathered here despite the cold, dampness, and long journey. The preacher delivered his sermons under a thatched roof, from which water could drip during rain. However, this did not bother anyone. Faith was the only constant in an unstable life. Songs were sung loudly, echoing off the earthen walls. These gatherings gave people comfort and hope. On days like these, the dugouts came alive. Instead of small family dinners, the rooms were filled with conversation, prayers, and laughter. Children played near the entrance, while adults discussed the news and the harvest. Important issues were decided here, from water distribution to helping the sick. These were true community centers. They brought people together more strongly than any building could. Life was especially hard for women. They had to combine hard physical labor with caring for the home and children. All the work of maintaining daily life in these impossible conditions fell on their shoulders. They struggled with the dirt and dampness that returned every day. They had to keep things tidy, fight dampness, and look after their children in cramped and dark rooms. The workload was enormous and constant. They cooked food on smoky stoves, where every spark could cause a fire. They had to constantly make sure that the smoke went outside. Otherwise, the house would fill with smoke. Women mended clothes by the light of a smoky lamp, squinting in the dim light. They washed clothes in icy water, heated the house, and treated children with herbs. All this was done in conditions of extreme lack of time and energy. Their work was endless. It was women who often suffered from isolation and melancholy. Unlike men, who could go to the fields or the city, women were tied to the home. Their world was limited to 4 earthen walls. Days and weeks could pass without a single conversation with anyone else. Loneliness became a heavy burden, especially in winter. This led to depression, which was then called soddy syndrome. A rare visit from a neighbor or a traveling merchant became the main events of the year. At such moments, women came alive, exchanged news, and shared experiences. Merchants brought fabrics, thread, books, and sometimes luxury items. The children rejoiced at the sound of unfamiliar voices. Simple human communication became a cure. These visits gave a sense of connection to the outside world. But despite all the difficulties, these communities survived. People worked hard, day after day, building new homes and farms. They learned to understand the climate, the land, and the animals. They accepted setbacks, replanted crops, and started over after storms and droughts. These settlements grew and became stronger. Small dugouts turned into real farms. Their strength lay not only in their endurance, but also in their ability to support each other. Someone else's misfortune became everyone's misfortune, and a common cause became a personal responsibility. Neighbors shared food, helped repair roofs, and looked after children. This sense of community formed a new type of society, a frontier society. It became the foundation for future cities and communities. It was a mutual responsibility that grew out of harsh conditions. Dugouts and sod houses were born out of necessity. These dwellings were a direct response to the lack of wood in the heart of the Great Plains, where the distance between trees could be measured in kilometers. Settlers arriving from forested areas were struck by the vastness of the prairies and how little building material there was around. In this harsh land, the only option was to use what was available underfoot, compacted sod, whose dense roots formed strong layers. A sod wall cost almost nothing and could be erected quickly, which was critical before the onset of winter. But once this challenge was overcome, the era of underground houses began to rapidly fade away. The main factor that killed the turf house was the railroad. It was the railroad that first connected the prairie farms to the industrial centers of the country, making remote areas part of the national market. The trains arriving from the east brought not only people and goods, but also a new world where everything could be bought. The railroad brought with it regular supplies of building materials that the first settlers could only dream of. Now wood was no longer a rarity. It became accessible, cheap, and reliable. The steel tracks laid across the prairies brought with them something that had never been seen here before: cheap lumber. Logging companies flooded the market with large quantities of boards, processed rafters, ready-made doors and windows. For a farmer living hundreds of kilometers from the nearest forest, this was a real miracle. He could order almost everything he needed for construction and receive it in a few days. Boards replaced sod as quickly as they became available for purchase. The old way of building became obsolete before our eyes. Companies that owned vast forest lands in the north and east sold materials at prices that no local solution could compete with. These companies developed mass production and could supply mountains of lumber with virtually no interruptions. Settlers no longer had to go on dangerous long trips for wood, cut it by hand, and transport it on ox carts. Everything became easier, faster, and cheaper. It was then that the prairies began to transform from a realm of sod into a land of wooden frame houses. The world was changing, and it was changing rapidly. Now a farmer in Kansas did not have to spend weeks cutting sod and digging the ground. He could go to the station in one day, select the materials he needed, and find out when his order would arrive. Although the roads were long, the trains ran regularly, and delivery became predictable. The ability to take out a loan from a local bank turned the dream of owning a home from soddy into a real wooden house built by the book. The railroad gave people a sense of stability and confidence in the future. The availability of materials actually changed the culture of construction in the region. He could take out a loan from the bank, go to the nearest station, and order a kit to build a real frame house. Banks actively supported new settlements and encouraged the construction of houses that cost more and lasted longer. For farmers, it was a profitable investment. A wooden house increased the value of the land and made life easier. Many stations even opened small storage areas where popular construction kits were kept. This brought modernity right to the settlers' doorsteps. Sod houses came to be seen as a temporary measure rather than permanent housing. A frame house was a symbol of success and civilization. It looked like the houses the prairie dwellers saw in their drawings, postcards, and memories of home. These houses were taller, more spacious, and gave a feeling of real elevation above the ground. As the settlers said, white walls and a neat porch became the pride of the family. Inside, it was easier to keep clean, fight insects, and store things. All this created a sense of belonging to a developing America. It was bright, dry, clean, and most importantly, it looked like what an American imagined a house should look like. Sod houses could not boast of high ceilings, large windows, or aesthetics. Frame buildings, on the contrary, created a space where you could decorate the walls, place furniture, and receive guests. The settlers aspired to this way of life because it symbolized stability and cultural development. It was not just a house, but an expression of the ideals to which the country aspired. The transition to this type of housing was a logical step in the development of communities. Moving from a sod house to a white wooden house with a porch was the main dream of any settler. Many families saved money for years, made plans, and discussed the future, imagining how their lives would change. The moment of moving into a new house became a family celebration. Children ran around the new rooms, and adults felt that they had reached an important stage in their lives. A frame house became a symbol of growth and hope. It told everyone around that the family had managed to overcome the most difficult times. Old dugouts and turf houses were not demolished. These dwellings were surprisingly durable. Walls packed with turf could withstand decades of use. Even if the family already lived in a new house, it was considered unreasonable to destroy the old one. They could still serve useful purposes. These rooms were cool in summer and relatively safe in winter. Their thickness made them ideal protective shelters. We saw how harsh necessity turned the pioneers of the Wild West into true underground architects. Dugouts and sod houses were not a whim, but the only possible way to survive in a treeless ocean of grass. These shelters, built of mud and grass, became the cradle for entire generations. They tell us a story not of heroic shootouts, but of a quiet daily struggle against cold, damp, and darkness. It is a story of how the will to live and incredible ingenuity helped people put down roots where there seemed to be nothing. What other topics from the history of the American frontier would you like to see on our channel? Perhaps you are interested in the life of mountain trappers or the life of nomadic hobo workers. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research.